John Wayne Gacy, born March 17th, 1942, Chicago, Illinois. Died May 10th, 1994, aged 52. Stateville Correctional Center, Crest Hill, Illinois. Other names: Killer Clown. Criminal status: executed by lethal injection. Spouse: Marion Myers. Carol Hoff. Children: 2. Convictions: Iowa, sodomy. Illinois, unaliving, 33 counts. Indecent liberties with a child. Devate sexual assault. Criminal penalty: death. Victims: 33 and counting. Span of crimes: 1972 to 1978. Country: United States. States: Illinois, Iowa. Date apprehended: December 21st, 1978. Imprisoned at Menard Correctional Center. John Wayne Gacy was born at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois on March 17th, 1942, the second of three children and only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Ellen Robinson. His father was an auto repair mechanic and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. John was of Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. John was close to his mother and two sisters, but had a difficult relationship with his alcoholic father, who was verbally and physically abusive to his family. The elder John frequently belittled his son, calling him dumb and stupid and comparing him unfavorably with his sisters. One of John's earliest childhood memories was of his father beating him at age 4 for accidentally disarranging car engine components. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up queer. In 1949, John's father whooped him after he and another boy were caught sexually fondling a young girl. The same year, a family friend began occasionally molesting John. John never told his father, afraid that his father would blame him. Despite their challenging relationship, John loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. John was an overweight and unathletic child because of a heart condition. He was told to avoid sports. In the fourth grade, John began to experience blackouts. He was hospitalized on occasions because of these episodes. Also in 1957 for a burst appendix. John later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he had spent almost a year in hospital. He attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. John's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. His father suspected he was malingering. On one occasion, he openly accused his son of faking as he lying in a hospital bed. In 1960, at the age of 18, John became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democrat Party candidate. This led to more criticism from his father, who called him a patsy. The same year, John's father brought him a car. He kept the vehicle's title in his own name until John had paid for it, and which took several years. His father would confiscate the keys if John did not do as he said. In April 1962, John purchased an extra set of keys. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the component for 3 days. Hours after his father replaced the cap, John left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada, with 136 to his name in the hope of residing with a cousin. John worked in the Las Vegas ambulance service before being transferred to Palm Mortuary. He worked as a mortuary attendant for 3 months, absorbing morticians. embalming bodies, and occasionally serving as a pallbearer. He slept on a cot behind the embalming room and later confessed that one evening, while alone, he clambered into the coffin of a teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This experience prompted John to return home. Well, he did that shit his damn self. Ain't nobody forced him. Shortly thereafter, John enrolled at Northwestern Business College. Despite having failed to complete high school, he graduated in 1963 and took a management trainee position with a Nunn-Bush shoe company. In 1964, the company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois to work as a salesman and eventually promoted him to department manager in March of that year. He became engaged to Marilyn Myers, a co-worker. During their courtship, John joined the local chapter of the JCs. That same year, he had his second homosexual experience. According to John, a colleague in the JCs piled him with drinks and invited him to spend the evening on his sofa. The colleague then performed oral sexual on him while he was drunk. By 1965, John had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield JCs and was named the third most outstanding JC in Illinois. John and Marilyn married in September 1964. Marilyn's father subsequently purchased three KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so John could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' former home. The offer, the offer, the offer was lucrative. John would receive 15,000 per year, the equivalent of about 152,600 as of 2025, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. John opened a club in his basement where his employees whew, could drink alcohol and play pool. Although John employed teenagers of both sexes, he socialized with only the males. John gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances. If they rebuffed him, he would claim his advances were jokes or a test of morals. John's wife gave birth to a son in February 1966 and a daughter in March of 1967. John later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When John's parents visited in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the abuse he had inflicted before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you," as he shook John's hand. In Waterloo, John joined the local JC's chapter regularly, offering extended hours to the organization in addition to the 12 14-hour days he worked managing the restaurants. At meetings, John often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and the other Waterloo JCs were also deeply involved in drug abuse, pornography, process, procession, and wife swapping. Ugh, wow. Although John was considered ambitious and a braggart, the JCs held him in high regard for his fundraising work. In 1967, he was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs and served on the board of directors. In August 1967, John sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees Jr., the son of Donald Edwin Voorhees, a local politician and fellow JC. John lured Voorhees to his house at the prompting of showing him heterosexual stag films regularly played at JC's events. John plowed Donald with alcohol, allowing him to watch a stab movie, then persuaded him to engage in mutual oral smexual, adding, "You have to have smexual with a man before you start having smexual with women." Over the following months, John abused several other youths, including one whom he encouraged to have smexual with his own wife, before blackmailing him into performing oral smexual on him. John also tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments for scientific research and paid them up to $50 each. Yeah, he's a nasty psychopath. In March 1968, Donald told his father that John had sexually assaulted him. Donald Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested John and charged him with performing oral sodomy on Donald and the attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynch. John vehemently denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. The results of these tests were indicative of deception. John publicly denied any wrongdoing and insisted the charges were politically motivated. Donald had opposed John's nomination for appointment as president of the Thank you, bless me. Several fellow JCs found John's story credible and rallied to his support. Y'all dumb. Oh, I can't stand people. Several fellow JCs, however, on May 10th, 1968, John was indicted on the sodomy charge. Yes, this, the most striking aspect of the test, results in the patient's total denial of responsibility for everything that has happened to him. He can produce an alibi for everything. He presents himself as a victim of circumstances and blames other people who are out to get him. The patient admits to assure a sympathetic response by depicting himself as being at the mercy of a hostile environment. Section of the report detailing Gacy's 1968 psychiatric evaluation. Damn, they knew he wasn't innocent. On August 30th, John promised one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schujwarrior, 300 if he physically assaulted Donald in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying in court. Russell lured Donald to an isolated park, sprayed mace in his eyes, and beat him. Donald escaped and reported Russell's actions to police. Russell was arrested the next day, initially denying involvement. He soon confessed to assaulting Donald, indicating that he had done so at John's request. Police arrested John and charged him with hiring Russell to assault and intimidate Donald. On September 12th, John was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the Psychiatric Hospital of the University of Iowa. Two doctors concluded that he had an antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for psychopathy in our psycho sociopathy and our psychopathy, was unlikely to benefit from treatment, and that his or her behavior pattern was likely to bring him into repeated patterns conflict with society. The doctors concluded John was mentally competent to stand trial. On November 7th, 1968, John pled guilty to one count of sodomy in relation to Donald, but not guilty to the charges related to other youths. He claimed Donald had offered himself to him and that he had acted out of curiosity. His story was not believed. John was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and to be served at Animos State Penitentiary. That same day, John's wife petitioned for divorce, requesting she be awarded the couple's home and property, sole custody of their two children, and alimony. Dang! The court ruled in her favor and the divorce was finalized on September 18th, 1969. John never saw his first wife or children again. Damn. During his incarceration, John rapidly acquired a reputation as a model prisoner. Within months of his arrival, he had risen to the position of head cook. He also joined the inmate JC chapter and increased its membership to 50 to 650 men in less than 18 months. John secured an increase in the inmates' daily pay in the prison's mess hall and supervised several projects to improve conditions for inmates, including the installation of a miniature golf course. What the fuck y'all need a golf course for? He was presented with a Distinguished Service Award for his efforts within the inmate JC chapter in February 1970. And in June 1969, John was denied parole to prepare for a second scheduled parole hearing in May 1970. He completed 16 high school courses, obtained his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day 1969, John's father died from cirrhosis. When informed of his father's death, John collapsed to the floor sobbing. His request for supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral was denied. John was granted parole with 12 months probation on June 18th, 1970, having served 18 months of his 10-year sentence. So he only served a year and a half? The hell? Conditions of his probation included a nightly curfew and that John relocate to Chicago to live with his mother. On his release, John told friend and fellow JC Clarence Lane, who picked him up from the prison, that he remained steadfast in his belief that John's innocence, that he would never go back to jail, and that he intended to reestablish himself in Waterloo. However, within 24 hours, John had relocated to Chicago. He arrived there by bus on June 19th and shortly thereafter obtained a job as a short order cook. On February 12th, 1971, John was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that he had lured him into his car at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal and driven him to his home, where he had attempted to force the boy into Smex. The court dismissed this complaint when the boy failed to appear. On June 22nd, John was arrested and charged with aggravated sac, sexual battery and reckless conduct in response to a complaint filed by a youth who claimed that John had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into his car, and forced him to perform oral sex. This charge were dropped after the complaint attempted to blackmail John. The Iowa Board of Parole did not learn of these incidents. John's parole ended on October 18th, 1971, and a month later, the records of John's criminal convictions in Iowa were sealed. What? Sealed? This is a grown man, not a. Ugh. With financial assistance from his mother, John bought a ranch style house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township, Illinois, part of metropolitan Chicago. He lived there until his arrest in December 1978 and, according to John, committed all his unalivings there. John was active in his local community and helpful towards his neighbors. He willingly loaned his construction tools and plowed snow from neighborhood walks free of charge. From 1974 to 1978, he hosted them annual summer parties. were attended by up to 400 people, including politicians and business associates. In August 1971, shortly after John and his mother moved into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school. Carol and her two young daughters from a previous marriage moved into the house soon after. They were married on July 1st, 1972. John's mother moved out of the house shortly before the wedding. By 1975, John had told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had specs on Mother's Day that year, he informed her this would be the last time they would do so. Huh? He began spending most evenings away from home, only to return in the early morning with the excuse that he had been working late and conducting business meetings. Kurt observed John bringing teenage boys into his garage in the early hours and also found gay pornography and men's wallets and identification inside the house. When she confronted John about these items, he informed her angrily that if it was none of her business. Ugh. In October 1975, after a heated argument, Carol asked John for a divorce. He agreed, although by mutual consent, he continued to live at his house until February 1976. On March 2nd, the Gacy's divorce decree on the false grounds of John's infidelity with women was finalized. Bitch, you stupid. Why would you want to be with him and he told you that was the last time? Yo, women are crazy. In 1971, John established a part time construction business, PDM Contractors, for painting, decorating, and maintenance. With the approval of his probation officer, John worked evenings on his construction contracts. While working as a cook during the day, initially he undertook minor repair work, but later expanded to include projects such as interior design, remodeling, and landscaping. In mid 1973, John quit his job as a cook so he could commit fully to his construction business. In 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly, and John was working up to 16 hours per day. Damn. In March 1977, he became a supervisor for PE Systems, a firm specialized in the remodeling of drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, John worked on up to 4 projects simultaneously and frequently traveled to other states. By 1978, PDM's annual revenue was over $200,000. Though his membership in a local moose club, John became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members regularly performed at fundraising events and parades, in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. In late 1975, John joined the Clown Club, created his own character Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, devising his own makeup and costumes. He described Pogo as a happy clown, whereas Patches was a more serious character. John seldomly earned money for his performances and later said that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. He performed as both Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, and children's hospitals. John's voluntary public service as a clown throughout the years of his unalivings led him to him being known as the unalived clown. Much of PDM's workforce consisted of high school students and young men. John would often proposition his workers for specs and insist on spectual favors in return for lending his vehicles, financial assistance, or promotions. Yo, dude, come on. John also claimed to own guns, once telling an employee, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and unalive you? And how easy it would be to get rid of the body? This man is horrible. In 1973, John and a teenage employee traveled to Florida to view a property John had purchased. While there, John raped the employee in their hotel room. After returning to Chicago, this employee drove to John's house and beat him in the front yard. John told his wife he had been attacked for refusing to pay for poor quality painting work. Wait, his wife? I thought they divorced. What's up with that? In May 1975, John hired 50-year-old Anthony and Antonici. 2 months later, he went to Anthony's home, knowing the youth had an injured foot. The two drank a bottle of wine and watched a heterosexual stag film before John wrestled Anthony to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. One cuff was loose, and Anthony freed his arm while John was out of the room. When John returned, Anthony, a high school wrestler, grappled with him, obtained the key, and cuffed John's hand behind his back. John threatened Anthony. They calmed down and promised to leave if he was freed. John agreed, and John left. Anthony continued working for PDM for 9 months after this incident, and John made no further attempts to assault him. He got lucky. Lucky, lucky, lucky. On July 26, 1976, John picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker David Cram and offered him a job with PDM and began work the same evening. On August 21st, Cram moved into John's house. The next day, David and John had several drinks to celebrate his 19th birthday. When John dressed as Pogo, John David conned David into donning handcuffs, his wrists cuffed in front of his body rather than behind. He swung David around while holding the chain linking the cuffs, then said he intended to grape David. David kicked John in the face and freed himself. A month later, John appeared at David's bedroom door, intending to grape him, saying, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." David resisted, straddling John, who left the bedroom, stating, "You ain't no fun." David moved out on October 5th and left PDM, although he periodically worked for John over the following 2 years. Shortly afterwards, he got lucky too. He really got lucky. Shortly afterwards, another employee, 18-year-old Michael Rosie, moved in. What are they moving in for? Michael had worked for PDM since May 23rd, 1976. He lived with John until April 1977. Michael sometimes assisted John in clowning at grand openings of businesses, John as Pogo and Michael as Patches. John entered local Democrat Party politics, initially offering use of his employees to clean party headquarters at no charge. He was rewarded with an invitation to serve on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee, subsequently earning the title of precinct captain. In 1975, John was appointed director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade. Through his work with the parade, which he would supervise until 1978, John met with a photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter wearing an S pin indicating a person given special clearance. The event later became an embarrassment to United States Secret Service. Y'all dumb as hell. Y'all dumb as hell. John unalived at least 33 young men and boys, 26 of whom he buried in the crawl space of his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Bug House Square, or off the streets with the promise of a job with PDM, and offered to drink and or drugs or money for specs. Some victims are grabbed by force, others were conned into believing John, who would carry a sheriff's badge and our red spotlights on his black Oldsmobile, was a policeman. John usually lured a lone victim to his house, although no more than one occasion John had what he called doubles, two unalived in the same evening. This sick bastard. Inside John's home, his usual modus operandi was to play a youth with drink drugs, or generally gain his trust. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs to show a magic trick, sometimes a part of a clowning routine. He typically cuffed his own hands behind his back, then superintendently released himself with a hidden key. He then offered to show his intended victim the trick. With his victim restrained, John proceeded to grape and torture. He frequently began by sitting on or straddling the victim's chest before forcing the victim to fellate him. John then inflicted acts of torture, including burning with cigarettes, making his captive imitate a horse as he sat on their back and pulled on makeshift rings around their necks, and violation with foreign objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after he had sodomized his captives. John frequently slayed his captives' ankles by a 2x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, an act inspired by the Houston Mass unalivers. He also taunted many victims throughout their abuse and was known to have partly drowned several in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them. This crazy fuck. John typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their neck and progressively tightening it with a hammer handle. Oh my God. He referred to this as the rope trick, frequently informing his victims that this is the last trick. Occasionally, the victim convulsed for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep in their throats. Except for his two final victims, all were unalived between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock a.m. John usually stored the victims' corpses under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten decomposition. Some were taken to his garage and embalmed prior to burial. This, this, ugh, ugh. John's first known murder occurred on January 3rd, 1972. According to John's later account, following a party the previous evening, he drove to the Civic Center in the Loop in the evening morning to view a display of ice sculptures. He then lured 60-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. Timothy was on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, and informed John his bus was not due until noon. John took Timothy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him to his home with the promise that he could spend the remainder of the night and be driven back to the station in time to catch his bus. Prior to Timothy's identification, he was known as the Greyhound busboy. John claimed he woke early the following morning to find Timothy standing in his bedroom doorway holding a kitchen knife. He jumped from his bed and Timothy raised his arm in a gesture of surrender, accidentally cutting John's forearm. John disarmed Timothy, banged his head against the bedroom wall, and kicked him against the wardrobe. Timothy kicked John in the stomach, doubling him over. John then grabbed Timothy, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. As Timothy lay dying, John claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw the makings of breakfast on the table. Timothy had set the table for two. He had walked into John's room to wake him while abstinently carrying the knife. Absent-mindedly carrying the knife. John buried Timothy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview several years after his arrest, John said that immediately after killing Timothy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that as he stabbed Timothy, elicited to the gurgulations and gasping, he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, that's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill. Ugh. Ugh. John said he committed unaliving for the second time around January 1974. This victims remain unidentified. He was strangled and placed in John's closet before burial. John later stated that bodily fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. John regularly stuffed rags, the victim's own underwear, or a sock to the mouth for subsequent victims to prevent such leakage. On July 1975, John Budakech, an 18-year-old PDM employee, is that Bakovich? A car was later found abandoned with his jacket and wallet inside and the keys in the ignition. The day before John's disappearance, John had confronted John over outstanding back pay. John's father called John, who claimed he was happy to help search for his son, but was sorry John had run away. When questioned by police, John said John had two friends had arrived at his house demanding the overdue pay, but they had reached a compromise and all three had left. Over the following 3 years, John's parents called police more than 100 times, urging them to investigate John further. John later admitted to encountering John exiting his car, waving to attract his attention. According to John, John approached him, stating, I want to talk to you. John invited John into his car and invited him back to his house, ostensibly to settle the issue over his overdue wages. At his home, John offered John a drink, then conned him into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. John later confessed to having sat on John's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed John's body in his garage, intending to bury the body later in the crawl space. When his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, John buried John under the concrete floor of the tool room extension of his garage in an empty space where he had intended to dig a drain tile. So Carol got back with him? In addition to being the year his business expanded, John freely admitted that 1975 was also when he began to increase the frequency of his excursions for specs with young males. He often referred to these jaunts as cruising. John committed most of his unalivings between 1976 and 1978 as a largely lived alone following his divorce. Although John remained grudging and civic-minded, several neighbors noticed behavioral changes after his 1976 divorce. including seeing him keeping company with young males, hearing his car arriving and departing in the early morning hours, or seeing lights in his home switch on and off in the early hours. One neighbor later recollected that for several years, muffled high pitched screaming, shouting, crying, and repeated awakened her and her son in the early morning. She identified the sounds as emanating from a house adjacent to theirs on West Summerland Avenue. 1 month after his divorce was finalized, John abducted and unalived 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. He was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6, 1976. John buried him under the dining room with cloth lodged in his throat. What? On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reifert disappeared shortly after returning home from a dental appointment. Hours after Randall was last seen by his family, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. He and Rifford were close acquaintances. They were buried together in a crawl space, and investigators believe the two were unalived the same evening. On June 3rd, John unalived 17-year-old Michael Bonning, who disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Wokan. John strangled Michael with a ligature and buried him under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, John unalived 16-year-old William Carl and buried him in a common grave in the crawl space. William seems to have been the first of four victims known to have been unalived between June 13th and August 6, 1976. Three were between 16 and 17 years old, and one unidentified victim appears to have been an adult. On August 5th, 16-year-old James Hackinson is last known to have phoned his family, possibly from John's home. James died of suffocation. His body was buried in the crawl space beneath 17-year-old Rick Johnston. Huh? Oh my God! Who was last seen alive on August 6th. John is thought to have murdered two unidentified males between August and October 1976. On October 24th, John abducted and unalived teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Morano, and the two were last seen on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, 19-year-old construction worker William Bondi disappeared after informing his family he was to attend a party. William died of suffocation. John buried the body beneath his master bedroom. William had apparently worked for John. Between November and December 1976, John unalived 21-year-old Francis Alexander. His last contact with his family was a phone call to his mother sometime in November. He was not reported missing as his family believed he had moved to California shortly thereafter. Francis was buried beneath the room John used as his office. Oh, God, I know his whole house stank. It had to stank. In December 1976, 17-year-old Gregory Gostick disappeared. His girlfriend last saw him outside her house. Gregory had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks when he disappeared. He had informed his family that John had him dig trenches for some kind of drain tiles in his crawl space. Gregory car was later found abandoned. His parents and older sister contacted John about Gregory's disappearance. John claimed that Gregory had expressed a wish to run away from home. He also claimed that he had received an answering machine message from Gregory shortly after he had disappeared. When asked if he could play the message for Gregory's parents, John said he had erased it. Because he lying. He lying. On January 20th, 1977, John lured 19-year-old John, I don't know, to his house on the pretext of buying his Plymouth satellite. He later confessed to strangling John in his spare bedroom, claiming Michael was asleep in the house the following morning. John later to- John later sold the car to Michael for $300. 2 months later, on March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestige disappeared. John was last seen leaving a near North Side restaurant. He was buried in the crawl space above the body of Francis Alexander shortly before his disappearance. John had mentioned he had obtained work with a local contractor. John unalived one additional unidentified youth and buried him in the crawl space in the spring or early summer of 1977. On July 5th, John unalived 19-year-old Matthew Bowman. Matthew's mother last seen him at a suburban train station. He had intended to travel to Harwood Heights for a court appointment. The following month, Michael was arrested for stealing gasoline while driving what's his name's car? Michael's car. No, I'm sorry, John's car. I'm sorry. The gas station attendant noted the license plate and police traced the car to John's house. When questioned, John told officers that John had sold the car to him in February, saying he needed money to leave town. A check of the VIN confirmed the car had belonged to John. The police did not pursue the matter any further, although they did inform John's mother that her son had sold his car. Lying. By the end of 1977, John had unalived six more young men between the ages of 16 and 21. The first of these was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, the son of Chicago police sergeant, last seen alive on September 15th. Robert lived 4 blocks from John's house. He was buried in the crawl space. On September 12th, John had flown to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to supervise a remodeling project and did not return to Chicago until September 16th. Because John was in another state at the time, Robert was last seen. This is cited to support John's claim of assistance from one or more accomplices in several homicides. 10 days after Robert was last seen, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Morey disappeared after leaving his mother's house. John strangled John and buried his body beneath the master bedroom. How many Johns are you going to kill, John? On October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nielsen disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson was looking for contract work. John unalived and buried Russell beneath the guest bedroom. Less than 4 weeks later, John unalived 60-year-old Robert Winch and buried him in the crawl space. 20-year-old Tommy Boyling disappeared on November 18th after leaving a Chicago bar. On December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Talsma disappeared after telling his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. John strangled David with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space close to John. You can't make this mess up. On December 30th, John abducted 19-year-old college student Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. John drove him to his home, where he raped, tortured, and repeatedly drowned Robert to unconsciousness in a bathtub. As he made statements such as, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Robert later testified at trial that he was in such pain that he asked John to kill him. John replied, "I'm getting round to it." After several hours, John drove Robert to his workplace and released him, warning him that if he complained to police, they would not believe him. Robert reported the assault, and police questioned John. On January 16th, 1978, John admitted to having had a slave spec relationship with Robert, but insisted everything was consensual and that he didn't pay the kid the money he had promised him. The police believed him and filed no charges. The following month, John killed 19-year-old William Kendrick, who disappeared on February 16th after telling his fiancee, who knew John, that he was going to a bar. William was the final victim buried in the crawl space. On March 21st, John lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Ringnell into his car. John chloroformed him and drove him to his house, where his arms and head were restrained in a pulmonary device, asphyxiated to the ceiling, and his feet locked into another device. He raped and tortured Jeffrey with instruments including lit candles, whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him to unconsciousness. John then dumped Jeffrey in Chicago's Lincoln Park, unconscious but alive. Jeffrey managed to stagger to his girlfriend's apartment. Police were informed to the assault but did not investigate John. William was able to recall the Oldsmobile that Kidney Expressway, a particular side street. He who he and two friends stalked out the Cumberland exit in the expressway. In April, William saw the Oldsmobile, which he and his friends followed to 8213 West Summerdale. John was arrested on July 15th. He faced trial for assault and battery against William. By mid 1978, the crawl space had no room for further bodies. John later confessed to police that he considered stowing bodies in his attic, but he had been worried about complications arising from leakage. Therefore, he chose to dispose of his victims off the 155 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy stated he had thrown five bodies into this river in 1978, one of which he believed had landed on a passing barrage. Only four were ever found. The first known victim thrown into the from the bridge was 20-year-old Timothy Rowick. He was unalived in mid-June after leaving his apartment to purchase cigarettes. Shortly before his disappearance, Timothy had told his roommate, to a contractor on the northwest side, he offered him a job. On November 4th, John unalived 19-year-old Franklin Langdon. He was last seen alive by his father walking along Foster Avenue. His naked body was found close to an inlet in the Des Plaines River by two duck hunters on November 12th. On November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazara disappeared after Thanksgiving dinner with his family. James had informed his sister the day before that he was walking into construction. He was last seen walking in the direction of Bughouse Square. Dang, that's all his victims have the same damn name, John, Timothy, Robert. Are they going to have different names now? On the afternoon of December 11th, 1978, John visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling deal for the store owner, Phil Torf. While he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Priest, John mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Priest earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after John left, whew, Robert's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home so the family could celebrate her birthday together. Robert asked his mother to wait, adding that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. Robert left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Robert was unalive shortly after 10 p.m. at John's home. John later stated that at his house he gave Robert a soft drink before asking whether there was anything he would do for the right price, to which Robert replied that he did not mind working hard. In response, John stated good money could be earned by hustling. Although Robert was dismissive, John then duped Robert into donning handcuffs. John's subsequently statements regarding the events varied, although in one of his initial statements he claimed Robert failed to resist as he removed the boy's trousers. He also stated that as he placed the rope around Robert's neck, the boy was crying scared. John admitted to having received a phone call from a business acquaintance as Robert lay dying. When Robert failed to return, his family filed a missing persons report with the Des Plaines police. Torf named John as the contractor Robert had most likely left the store to talk to. Lieutenant Joseph Kosnax, whose son attended Maine West High School like Robert, chose to investigate John further. A check of John's criminal background revealed that he had an outstanding battery charge in Chicago and had been imprisoned in Iowa for sodomy of a 50-year-old boy. Joseph and two Des Plaines police officers visited John at his home. The following evening, John indicated that he had asked one of the youths working at the pharmacy, who he believed to be Robert, whether there were any remodeling materials behind the store. He was adamant, however, that he had not offered Robert a job. He had mainly returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m., as he had left his appointment book. John promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement indicating he was unable to do so at that moment, as his uncle had just died. When questioned as to how soon he could come to the police station, he responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" At 3:20 a.m., John arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been involved in a car accident. On return to the police station later that day, John denied any involvement in Robert's disappearance and repeated that he had not offered him a job. John reiterated that he had returned to the pharmacy in response to a phone call from Phil informing him that he left his appointment book at the store. Detectives had already spoken with Philip, who denied calling John. At the request of detectives, John prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11th. Suspecting John might be holding Robert at his home, Des Plaines police obtained a search warrant on December 13th. This search revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges, a starting pistol, a syringe, a hydraulic needle, handcuffs, books about homosexuality and pederasty, pornographic and stag films, collapse of amyl nitrate, a dilutal, a 2x4 with two holes. A dildo, a drill of two holes into each end, bottles of volume and atrophy, several driver's license, a blue hooded parka, and underwear too small to fit John. They also found a class ring engraved the initials JAS and a Nissan pharmacy photo receipt in a trash can alongside a 36-inch section of nylon rope. The Des Plaines police confiscated John's automobile and other PD work vehicles. Surveillance teams consisting of officers Mike Alberich and David Heimster and Ronald Robertson and Robert Schultz monitored John as the investigation continued. The following day, investigators received a phone call from Michael, who informed the investigator that Gregory disappeared and the fact that another PDM employee, Charles Hadua, had been found drowned in the Illinois River earlier that year. On December 15th, Des Plaines investigators obtained further details of John's battery charge, learning Jeffrey Rignall had reported that John had lured him into his car, then chloroformed, raped, and tortured him before dumping him in Lincoln Park. In an interview with John's former wife the same day they learned of the disappearance of John Bokovich, the same day the class ring was traced to John Allen Sinks. An interview with John's mother revealed that several items from her son's apartment were also missing, including a Motorola television. I didn't know Motorola made a television. I just thought they made cell phones. By December 16th, John was becoming admirable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or at his home. He repeatedly denied involvement in Robert's disappearance and accused officers of harassing him because of his political connections of his recreational drug use. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he taunted them by floating traffic laws, succeed in losing his pursuers more than once. That afternoon, Cram consisted to a police interview in which he revealed that because of his poor timekeeping, John had once given him a watch, explaining he got it from a dead person. Yeah. Investigators conducted a formal interview of Michael on December 17th. He informed them John had sold him John's vehicle, explaining that he had brought a car from John because he needed money to move to California. A further examination of John's Oldsmobile revealed a small cluster of fibers in the truck suspected to be human hair. That evening, three trained search dogs were used to determine whether Robert had been present in any of John's vehicles. One laid on the passenger seat of John's Oldsmobile, and what the dog handler informed investigators was a death reaction. Huh? Indicating Robert's body had been present. Oh my gosh! That evening, John invited detectives Alberich and Hammermeister to a restaurant for a meal. Early on December 18th, he invited them into another restaurant where over breakfast he discussed his business, his marriages, and his clowning. During the conversation, John remarked, "You know, clowns get away with unaliving." By December 18th, John was beginning to display signs of strain from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired and anxious, and was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they cease their surveillance. The same day, the Nissan pharmacy photo receipt found in John's kitchen was traced to 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a colleague of Roberts at Nissan's pharmacy. Kimberly stated that she had borrowed Robert's Perca earlier in the evening and had placed the receipt in the pocket just before she returned the coat to Robert as he left the store. The same evening, Michael was interviewed a second time. This time, he was more cooperative. He informed detectives that in the summer of 1977, that John B. Haste, he had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of John's house. On December 19th, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant for John's house. The same day, John's lawyer filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The hearing for the suit was scheduled for December 22nd. That afternoon, John invited the surveillance detective inside his house again. As Robinson distracted John with conversation, Schultz walked into John's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola television they suspected belonged to John. while flushing John's toilet. The officer noticed a rancid smell. He suspected could be that of rotting corpses emancipated from the heated duct. The officers who had searched John's house previously had failed to notice this, as the house had been cold. Investigators interviewed both Cram and Michael on December 20th. When questioned as to where he believed John had concealed Robert's body, Michael replied John may have placed the body in a crawl space. Michael agreed to submit to a polygraph test. He denied any involvement in Robert's disappearance or any knowledge of his whereabouts. He soon refused to continue the questioning, and Robert's erratic and inconstant responses, while attached to the polygraph machine, rendered Kosnak unable to render a definite opinion as to his truthfulness. Michael did, however, further discuss the trench digging he did in a crawl space and remarked on John's insistence that he did not deviate from where he was instructed to dig. Cram informed investigators of John's attempts to grape him in 1976. He stated that after he and John had returned to his home after December 13th search, John had turned pale after seeing a clod of mud on his carpet and had immediately entered the crawl space to look for evidence of digging. And when asked whether he had been to the crawl space, Cram replied he had once been asked by John to spread lime down there and had also dug trenches. When John had explained where the drainage pipes, Cram stated the trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep, the size of graves. On the evening of December 20th, John drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting, ostensibly to discuss the process of his civil suit. John appeared anxious and disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink. Seb Amerniet fetched a bottle of Seagram's whiskey, and John immediately drank 2 cupfuls. By the stage dubious of John's claims of innocence, then asked what he had to discuss with them, placing a copy of the Daily Herald on his desk and stating, you said you had something new to tell me, something important. John picked up the newspaper, pointed to the front page article covering the disappearance of Robert, and said, this boy is dead. He's dead. He's in a river. Ooh. John then proceeded to give rambling confessions that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began stating he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people, and that he now wanted to be the same for himself. He stated he had unalived at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawl space, and had disposed of 5 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. John dismissed his victim as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids with their hands cuffed behind their back. He had buried their bodies in his crawl space as he believed they were his property. Mentally ill. As a result of the alcohol he had consumed, John fell asleep midway through his confession. Amarante immediately arranged a psychiatric appointment for John that morning. On awakening several hours later, John shook his head when informed by Amarante he had confessed to killing approximately 30 people, saying, well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do. Ignoring his lawyer's advice regarding his scheduled appointment, John left to attend to his business. John later recollected his memories of his final day of freedom as being hazy, adding he knew his arrest was inevitable and that he intended to visit his friends and say his farewells. After leaving his lawyer's office, John drove to a gas station where he handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag to surveillance officers, adding that John had told him, the end is coming for me. These guys are going to kill me. John then drove to the home of a fellow contractor and friend, Ronald Road. John hugged Ronald before bursting into tears, saying, "I've been a bad boy. I unalived 30 people, give or take a few." John left Ronald and drove to Cram's home to meet with Cram and Michael. Their surveillance officers noted he was holding a rosary to his chin, praying while he drove along the expressway. After talking to Cram and Michael, John had Cram drive him to a scheduled legal meeting. Cram informed the surveillance officers that John told him and Michael that he had confessed to over 30 unalivings with his lawyers the previous evening. John then had Cram drive him to Mary Hill Cemetery where his father was buried. As John drove to various locations that morning, police outlined the formal draft of their second search warrant, specially to search for Robert's body in the crawlspace. On hearing from their surveillance detectives that, in light of his erratic behavior, John might be about to commit smurdercide, police decided to arrest him on the charge of possession of distribute of cannabis in order to hold him in custody as the formal request for a second search warrant was presented at 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, the evening of the hearing. John's civil suit second search warrant was granted after police informed John of the intentions to his crawl space for the body of Robert. John denied the teenager was buried there, but confessed to having unalived in self defense of a young man whose body was buried under his garage. Armed with a signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians drove to John's home. They found John had unplugged his sump pump, floating the crawl space with water. He replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. Evidence technician Daniel Gently then entered the 28 by 38-foot crawl space, crawled to the southwest area, and began digging. Within minutes, he uncovered putrefied flesh and a human arm bone. Gently shouted to the investigators that they could charge John with unaliving, adding, "I think this place is full of kids." A police photographer uncovered patilia, a patilia in the northeast corner. The two began digging the southeast corner, uncovering two lower leg bones. The victims were too decomposed to be Robert. As the body in the northeast corner was unearthed, a crime scene technician discovered the skull of a second victim alongside this body. Later excavations of the feet of this second victim revealed a further skull beneath the body. Because of this, technicians returned to the trench where the first body was unearthed, discovering the rib cage of a fourth victim confirmed and scale of the unalivings. Oh my gosh, they're just piled on top of each other. After being informed that the police had found human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face unaliving charges, John told officers he wanted to clear the air. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, and in the presence of his lawyers, John provided a formal statement in which he confessed to unaliving approximately 30 young males, all of whom he claimed had entered his house willingly. Some victims were referred to by the name, but John claimed not to know or remember most of the names. He claimed all were teenage male runaways or male prostitutes, a majority of whom he had buried in his crawl space. John claimed to have dug only 5 of the graves in this location and had his employees, including John, dig the remaining trenches so that he would have graves available. When shown a driver's license issued to Robert Haston, which had been found on his property, John claimed not to know this individual, but admitted that this license had been in the possession of one of his victims. He also confessed to having planned to further conceal the bodies beneath this property by covering the entire crawl space with concrete. In January 1979, when questioned specifically about Robert, John confessed to luring him to his house and strangling him on December 11th. He also admitted to having slept alongside Robert's body that evening. Ew! Before disposing of the corpse in Des Plaines River in the early hours of December 13th. You are a nasty, nasty man. On his way to the police station, he had been in a minor traffic accident. After disposing of Robert, his vehicle had slid off an ice covered road and had to be towed free. Oh. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, John was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23rd to pinpoint the precise spot where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert and four other victims into the river. John was then taken to his house and instructed to mark his garage floor with orange spray paint to show where he had buried the individual he had supposedly unalived in self-defense, whom he had named John Bothwick. To assist officers in their search, John drew a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where the bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from John's crawl space. Over the next week, three others were also unearthed elsewhere on his property as the flooring and walls of the property were dismantled. Additional evidence include identification cards and further defects specs books were discovered. Okay. Only 28 of Gary's victims have been conclusively identified. The youngest were Samuel Steplin and Michael Moreno, both 14. The eldest were Francis Alexander and Russell Nelson, both 21. That's sick, man. Cook County Medical Examiner Robert Stein supervised the exhumations of the victims buried on John's property. The crawl space was marked in sections for each body, was given the identifying number. The first body recovered from the crawl space was assigned a marker denoting the victim as body 1. He was identified as John Prestige on January 6, 1979. No cause of death could be determined. John Boschwick was labeled as Body 2. He was among the first to be identified on December 29, 1978. On December 23rd, investigators returned to unearth the three corpses, which had been buried in the same trench as Body 1. Body 3, John Sitch, was buried in the crawl space directly above Body 4, George Goswick. Both were identified December 29th, 1978. Body 5 was buried directly beneath Body 1. This victim was discovered 36 inches below the surface of the soil, indicating he was the first to be buried in this common grave. The search was postponed over Christmas. Four bodies were unearthed on December 26. Body 6, Samuel Steplin, identified through dental records. November 14th, 1979. The body 7, Randall Reffert, identified through x-rays. April 12th, 1979, were buried in the same grave. Randall was found in a fetal position with a cloth gag in his mouth, leading investigators to conclude he was most likely died of asphyxiation. Body 8, Matthew Bowman, identified January 29th, 1979, was found with a tourniquet used to strangle around his neck. Body 9, Timothy McCoy, identified Viva Dental Records, and a distinctive belt buckle in May 1986 was found beneath a layer of concrete and had several stab wounds to his ribs and sternum. Investigators suggesting he was John's first victim. On December 27th, 8 more bodies were discovered. Body 10 buried beneath the entrance of John's home. remains unidentified. He is estimated to have been between 17 and 21 years old and between 5'7" and 5'11". Both body 11 and body 12 were found with ligatures around their necks and buried beside each other in the center of the crawl space. On September 11, 1979, they were identified as Robert Winch and Tommy Bornley, respectively. Can you close the door? Body 13, still identified, was found beneath the spare bedroom. He is estimated to have been between 17 and 22 years old and between 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet 2 inches. Bodies 14 and 15 were recovered from a common grave. Both were found with their head and upper torsos inside separate plastic bags. They were identified using dental records and radiology images as Michael Morano and Kenneth Parker on March 29, 1980. Too late to include among the victims identified before John's trial. Body 16, Russell Nelson, identified January 6, 1979, was found with a cloth rag lodged deep in his throat, causing him to die of suffocation. The 17th victim, identified as David Tosma, using radiology images, November 16, 1975, he was found with a ligature. Here. Okay. Around his neck. The following day, four more bodies were exhumed. Body 19 was buried directly beneath John's master bedroom. Body 18, Michael Bodie, identified January 6, 1975, was located beneath the spare bedroom and found with a ligature around his neck. Body 20, John Morey, identified through dental records January 27, 1979, was buried in the northwest corner of the crawl space. By December 29th, six more bodies were unearthed. Body 22, 23, 24, and 26 were buried in common graves beneath Gracie's kitchen and laundry room. With body 25, Robert Gilroy, identified January 6, 1979, located beneath Gracie's John's bathroom. That's probably what stunk. Body 26, still unidentified, was estimated to have been between 23 and 30 years old and approximately 5'4" in height. Body 22, identified using dental records as William Carroll on March 17, 1979, was found beneath John's kitchen with cloth-like material lodged in his throat. Two socks were recovered from the pelvic region. He was buried directly beneath body 21, recovered the previous day. This victim, who remained unidentified, is estimated to have been aged between 15 and 24 and approximately 5'10". The bones of victims 23, identified as Rick Johnston, January 1st, 1979, and 24 common gold cloth was found inside the mouth of bodies 24 and 26. Body 25 was found beneath John's bathroom with cloth in his throat. The final victim, recovered from the crawl space, William Kendrick, identified May 16, 1979, was also found beneath the bathroom with cloth lodged deep in his throat. Operations were suspended due to the Chicago blizzard of 1979, but resumed in March despite John's insistence that all the buried victims had been found. On March 9th, body 28 was found wrapped in several plastic bags and buried beneath the patio of John's backyard. John's likely second unalive victim was still unidentified. He stood approximately 5 feet 9 and is estimated to be aged between 14 and 18. On March 16th, body 29, Daryl Samuelson, identified November 18th, 1979, was found beneath the dining room. How did his house not stink, you guys? All the victims discovered at John's house were in advanced state of decomposition. Dental records and x-ray charts helped Stein identify the remains. 33 were identified via dental records and 2 via skeletal trauma. These identifications were supported with personal artifacts found in John's home. The head and upper torso of several bodies unearthed beneath John's property had been placed in plastic bags. In some cases, bodies were found in foreign objects, such as prescription bottles, lodged in their pelvic region, the position of which indicated the items had been thrust into the victim's anus. Stein concluded 12 victims recovered from John's property died of asphyxiation. John's vacant house was demolished in April 1979. The victim found 6 miles downstream from the I-55 bridge on June 30th was not connected initially to John. On January 9th, 1979, this victim was identified using fingerprint records and a distinctive tattoo as Timothy Rourke. An autopsy was unable to rule out strangulation as the cause of death. This victim was number 31. Following John's arrest, investigators discovered he was a further victim. Frank Lingady's cause of death was certified at autopsy as suffocation through his own underwear being lodged down his throat. His body was also identified via fingerprint records. A bond slip issued to Franklin the day before his death was found at John's home. He was assigned victim number 32. On December 28th, one further body linked to John was found 1 mile from the 155 bridge. The victim was identified 2 days later as James Mazara, whom John confessed to having unalived shortly after Thanksgiving. James had been strangled with a ligature. On April 9th, 1979, a man walking along Grundy County towpath discovered a decomposed body tangled in roots on the edge of the Des Plaines River. The body was identified via dental records as being that of Robert Pice. The same evening, an autopsy revealed that paper-like material that had been shoved down his throat caused him to suffocate. Oh my jeez. 5 victims have never been identified based on John's confession. The location of the victims buried in the crawl space and forensic analysts police determined the most likely dates for his identified victims were killed. January 3rd, 1972 through July 31st, 1975, body 28, backyard, male, age 14 to 18. June 13th through August 6, 1976, body 26, crawl space, male, age 23 to 30. August 6th through October 5th, 1976, body 13, crawl space, male, age 17 to 22. August 6th through October 24th, 1976, body 21, crawl space, male, age 15 to 24. March 15th, July through July 5th, 1977, body 10, crawl space, male 17 to 21. In the fall of 1979, forensic expert Betty Pat used the skulls of the remaining identified victims to create facial reconstructions. On October 11th, the Cook County Sheriff Thomas Starr announced that investigators have obtained DNA profiles from the identified victims were to renew their efforts to identify them. At a press conference, Sheriff Dart stated investigators were seeking DNA samples from across the United States related to any male missing between 1970 and 1979. So far, the identified of 3 victims have been confirmed. Numerous other missing youths have been ruled out as being victims of John. The 4 unrelated cold cases dating between 1972 and 1979 have been solved. Updated facial reconstructions of bodies 10 and 13 were released in 2018. I didn't see that. In November 2011, William Bundy was shortly identified through DNA testing. Shortly after John's arrest, William's family had contacted his dentist in hope of submitting his dental records for comparison with the unidentified bodies, but the records have been destroyed after his dentist had retired. In July 2017, 60-year-old James Hackinson was identified using DNA testing. Francis Wayne Alexander was identified via forensic genealogy in October 2021. That was recent. At this time, of John's arrest, he had claimed to investigators that the total number of victims could be as high as 45. However, only 33 victims were ever linked to John. Investigators excavated the grounds of his property until they had exposed the substadium of clay beneath the foundation, finding 29 bodies. Shortly after his arrest, John informed investigators that after he had assaulted and released Jeffrey Rignow in March 1978, he began to throw his unalived victims into Des Plaines River. He confessed to having disposed of 5 bodies in his manner. However, only 4 bodies recovered from the Des Plaines River were linked to him. When asked whether they were more victims, John stated, "That's for you guys to find out." Damn. Disputed DNA and dental tests conducted between 2012 and 2016 indicate that neither body found in the common grave of John's crawl space and identified as those of Kenneth Parker and Michael Morano in 1980 was actually Morano. Morano's mother had always doubted her son's identification because the clothing found on body 14 was inconsistent with that he had worn when he was last seen. DNA tests conducted on the exhumed body of Parker has proven that Morano's body had been mistaken for his. In addition, the dental x-ray conducted on the victim identified as Michael Morano had revealed he had all of his second molars. A dental x-ray conducted on Morano in March 1976 revealed one molar had not erupted. The original identification of the body has been disputed because the exhumed body had neither an upper nor lower jawbone. Nevertheless, the orthodontist who had identified Morano's remains has stated his conviction in the accuracy of his findings. On May 23rd, 1978, 25-year-old Charles Antonio Hadula was found drowned in the Pectonia River near Fort Free, Illinois. He has been missing since May 13th. Charles was an employee of PDM and had been linked to the initial investigation of John after Michael informed investigators of both Georgie's Gregory's disappearance and Charles' death. Moreover, Michael had stated that Charles was known to have conflicts with John, and when he had failed to show up to work, John had informed him that several other employees that he had drowned. At the time of Charles' death, no more bodies could have stored in John's crawl space, which leaves a possibility that he had disposed Charles' body in the Pecatonica River. However, Des Plaines authorities have contacted Freeport during their investigation into John and were told Charles had fallen to his death from a bridge. John's death has been officially ruled as asphyxia by drowning. Okay, I'm not reading that. That's too long. This is already too long. All right, now. All right. Ooh. John was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 unalivings. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, by Judge Louis Garple. The jury was selected from Rockford because of extensive press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, John spent over 300 hours with doctors and a Menard Correctional Center in Chester. In the year before his trial, he underwent a variety of psychological tests to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. John attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and the policeman called Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. When John had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyer To have John plead not guilty for reason of insanity, in his open statement, one of John's defense attorneys, Robert Moda, remarked the insanity defense hath been looked upon as an escape, a defense of last resort. The defense of insanity is valid, and it is the only defense that would use here, because that is where the truth lies. Because if John is normal, then our concept of normality is totally distorted. Presenting John as a Jekyll and Hyde character, the defense produced several psychiatric experts who had examined John. Three testified they found him to be paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. The prosecutor argued that John was sane and in full control of his actions. They produced several witnesses to testify to his premeditation and the efforts he took to escape detection. These doctors refuted the defense. Doctors claimed to have multiple personalities is insanity. Cram and Michael testified that John had made them dig drainage trenches and spread bags of lime in this crawl space. Both said John took periodically into the crawl space to ensure they and other employees were supervised that did not deviate from the precise location he had marked. On February 18th, Robert Stain testified that all the bodies recovered from John's property were marked, decomposed, and putrefied, skeletalized remains, and that of all autopsies were performed, 13 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of ligature strangulation, 1 of multiple stab wounds to the chest, and 10 in undetermined ways. John's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxiation. Stain called this highly improbable. Jeffrey testified in the defense on February 21st. Jeffrey wept repeatedly while descending John's torture of him in March 1978. During Pacific while describing John's torture of him in March 1978, during Pacific cross-examination relating to the torture, Jeffrey vomited and was excused from further testimony. On February 29th, Donald testified to his ordeal about John's hands and his assault at John's behest. Donald felt unable to testify, but did briefly in an attempt to do so before being asked to step down. Robert testified the week after Donald, recounting his ordeal at John's hands. In December 1997, Robert was visibly distressed as he recalled the abuse. During the fifth week of the trial, John wrote a personal letter to Judge Garpio requesting a mistrial for reasons including that he did not appear of his lawyers' insanity plea, that his lawyers had not allowed him to take the witness stand as he wanted to, and his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, and that the police were lying, and in regard to verbal statements he had alleged made to detectives after his arrest, and that in any event the statements were self-serving for use by prosecution. Judge Garbo informed John that both counsels had not been denied the opportunity or funds to summon experts, witnesses to testify, and that under the law had the choice whether he wished to testify and was free to indicate as much as to the judge. On March 11th, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. Prosecuting attorney Terry outlined John's history of abusing youth, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection and disturbing the surviving victims, Donald and Robert, as living dead, referring to John as the worst of all unalivers. John has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. All the state's 4-hour closing counsel, Sam spoke to the defense. Sam accused Selvin of scarcely referring to the evidence in his own closing argument and arousing hatred against his client. He attempted to portray John as driven by compulsive, but was unable to control, continuing to the state, blah, 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 blah. On the morning of March 12th, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution, can refer to the defense constitution of insanity as a sham. Okay, the jury deliberated for 1 hour and 50 minutes. John was found guilty of 33 charges of unaliving. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both in reference to Robert. At the time, his conviction of 33 unalivings was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing John to death for each unaliving committed after the Illinois statute on capital punishment came into effect on June 1977. His execution was set for June 2nd, 1980. Being sentenced, John transformed to the Minyard Correctional Center, where he remained on death row for 14 years, repeatedly proclaiming often viva conflicting claims his alleged innocence. Isolation in his prison cell, John began to paint with his artwork, occasionally produced viva commission. He drew inspiration from a wide range of sources from his artwork, depicting subjects as diverse as clowns, including himself as Pogo or Patches. Before his trial, John initiated contact with journalist Russ Ring, in whom he granted numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Irving later collaborated with author Tim Coghill to publish the book Buried Dreams. The information John divulged to Irving regarding the circumstances of his first unaliving would prove instrumental to establish the identity of his first victim. On February 18, 1983, Henry Bushborn, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 unaliver, stabbed John in the arm with a sharp wire. He received treatment. After his incarceration, John read law books and filed voluminous motions and appeals. Although he did not prevail in any, his appeals relate to issues such as vouching for the first search warrant. Okay. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld John's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14th. John filed an appeal against this decision and was denied by the Supreme Court of the United States. On March 4th, 1985, the following year, John filed a further post-conviction petition seeking a new trial. His then defense lawyer, Richard Kling, argued that John had been provided with ineffective legal counsel at his 1980 trial. This petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. John appealed the 1985 decision that he be executed, and Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction on September 29, 1988, stated a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the Supreme Court denied John's final appeal on October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10th. On the morning of May 9, 1994, John was transferred to State Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family for his first meal. John ordered a bucket of KFC, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That evening, he received his last rites with a Catholic priest before being escorted to the Stateville execution chamber. In the hours leading up to John's execution, a crowd estimate of over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. A vocal majority were in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were present. Some of those in favor of the execution wore T-shirts hearkening to John's previously community services as a clown, bearing structural slogans such as "No tears for the clown." Wow. At 12:40 a.m., the procedure of administer of lethal injection began. Although the chemicals used to the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the IV tube, the execution team replaced the clogged tube and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting the execution. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. He got a much easier death than any of his victims. According to published reports, John was a diagnosed schizophrenic, diagnosed psychopath who did not express any remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that unaliving him would not compensate for those loss of others, and that the state was unaliving him. His final spoken words were reported to be "kiss my ass." Although prosecutor William Kinkle stated in 2020 that these words were spoken to a prison official who were not part of any official statement prior to John's execution. After John's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at John's trial, who has interviewed John and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits in violent psychopaths. He was cremated, and the whereabouts of his ashes remain undisclosed. And this is what he ate.